Welcome to the last nutrient cycle vodcast. In this vodcast, we're going to be exploring the phosphorus cycle. I'd like you to have your data booklet out and open to the phosphorus cycle diagram given to you so that you can familiarize yourself with what is shown in this diagram in order to utilize it effectively on your test as well as your provincial exam. So phosphorus is an important part, just like all the other nutrients. It's an important part for all living cells, and specifically, phosphorus is associated with our main energy carrier. And so our energy in living cells is known as adenosine triphosphate. So there's that phosphorus that belongs in this energy molecule. In plants, phosphorus promotes root growth, stem strength, as well as seed production. In addition to being an energy carrier in animals, the phosphorus, along with calcium, is also really important for strong bones. So in looking at phosphorus storage, just like we looked at carbon sinks and as well as nitrogen stores, it's important to note here that there is no atmospheric phosphorus like we saw with carbon and nitrogen. Instead, we're looking at these stores of phosphates, not phosphorus, and I'm going to explain what this means in a little bit, of phosphates in sedimentary rock and sediments on the ocean floor. This is our largest store of phosphorus. Before I get into talking about how phosphorus is actually cycled within the ecosystem, what I first want to just talk about is, although I'm using this term phosphorus here, as those of you who might remember back to Science 9, we're looking here at just the P from the periodic table. However, this term phosphates, if you remember when we looked at the polyatomic ions, or if you remember just in class when we talked about nitrates, we had nitrates, and this was the formula for a nitrate. And so this phosphate, it's just an ionic an ion that that will contain that phosphorus. So that's the actual formula for phosphates when we're talking about them. And so these might be in combination with other things like sodium phosphates or calcium phosphates. But this is what we're discussing when we're phosphates. And specifically, it's just because it contains that phosphorus. And so phosphates are released from those long-term stores. And so those long-term stores, if you remember back, the previous slide, we're looking at those sediments. And so they get cycled through a process of weathering in which rocks are broken down into smaller fragments and therefore they're released into the soil. Now there are two types of weathering that occurs. First off, there is a chemical weathering, and this is caused by acid precipitation. Now, if you remember, this acid precipitation is caused by an effect from the nitrogen cycle, or it can also be caused by lichens. Now, lichens, this is a symbiotic association between fungus and photosynthetic bacterium, which are called algae. So both acid precipitation and lichens cause a chemical reaction that release these phosphates into the soil. Now, the second type of weathering we have is a physical weathering, and this is physically caused by wind, water, and freezing, in which particles of the rock or the sediment are broken down into smaller pieces and therefore released into the soil. And when they do that, that sediment is releasing and cycling that phosphate back into the soil. So along with weathering, plants can also take up that phosphorus into their roots, and then the animals who eat the plants get the phosphate into their systems, and then the decomposers will return those phosphates to the soil. And so this is just something that's similar we've seen in the carbon cycle and in the nitrogen cycle, and they get broken down, and therefore the animal waste and dead organisms can recycle that phosphate that was taken up into their systems to begin with. Now, similar to the nitrogen cycle, excess phosphate enters the aquatic ecosystems as a result of leaching, erosion, and runoff from the mountain ranges near any sort of body of water. Most phosphorus settles onto the bottom and therefore turns into sediment. And the last place we're going to see phosphorus cycling is through a process called geologic uplift. So this is those sediments that had settled onto the ocean floors. And when the Earth's crust folds, therefore the mountain ranges begin to build, as we know that many mountain ranges are built in that manner. And therefore that deeply buried sediment or rock layers begin to rise and become exposed. And therefore with that, it exposes the phosphorus, and therefore the cycle of weathering can begin all over again. So an example of this is Mount Everest. All of those layers that you see in Mount Everest is made up of limestone, and that had originally formed from the ancient sea floor. We know this because of the fossil marine creatures that we find in Mount Everest layers. And therefore, that phosphorus is being cycled back up into those mountain ranges through geologic uplift and can be therefore cycled through weathering and leaching and erosion that we've already talked about. Okay, let's come back to this diagram of the phosphorus cycle in the data booklet. So when we're talking about phosphorus cycling, we're really looking at these arrows that are over off to the left-hand side of this diagram. And so here we can see, here are the sediments, and based off of geologic uplift, the rocks that contain phosphate through a process of weathering will allow that phosphate to get into the soil, and then the roots of the plants will take up that phosphorus, and therefore the herbivores will eat the plants, and anything else that eats that herbivore will also obtain that phosphorus. And therefore, when these plants and animals are broken down, the plant and animal waste comes back into the soil, and the decomposers break it back down, and therefore it goes into the soil again. So you can see there is a lot of information already within this diagram to answer questions for you on a test. Let's also look at the square boxes. So these are the stored amounts of phosphates. And so we're looking at ocean sediment and the Earth's crust as having the highest numbers. And through a process of uplifting, we can also see mineable phosphate as well as terrestrial organisms. And there's one more. Marine life up here also does contain a store of phosphorus. But by and far the largest store that we see, the long-term store, would be the ocean sediments as well as the Earth's crust. So in the last part, let's talk about the human activities and how we are negatively affecting the phosphorus cycle. So just like the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle, we are upsetting this nutrient balance. And so ways that we are contributing to it is we are adding to the excess phosphorus through mining for fertilizers. We are also using a lot of phosphate-containing detergents, which ends up back in our soils and back into our oceans. Animal waste from livestock farming, industrial waste, and untreated human sewage. All of this contributes to the excess amount that we're contributing to the phosphorus cycle. And so much of this enters into our waterways through runoff and leaching. And just like the nitrogen cycle, a phosphorus excess can lead to eutrophication as well as the algal blooms. Again, and remember, those are the terms that we can use. Eutrophication can lead to that hypoxic dead zone, or those algal blooms can lead to that red tide and therefore affect our marine ecosystems. Now, humans reduce phosphorus when we use a slash and burn process to clear forests. This releases phosphates contained in the trees in the form of ash. This ash accumulates in the soil and enters into the water bodies through leaching and runoff. And once there, it settles to the bottom and becomes unavailable for those organisms. So before tomorrow, I'd like you to take some time and complete this table in which we're summarizing up the 3 different nutrient cycles. So if you can remember back, we're going to be looking at carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. I want you to be labeling the short-term and long-term stores, especially when it comes to the carbon. And I want you to also look at the cycling process. Now remember the cycling process for the carbon. There was the 6 for carbon. There were 3 different ones available for the nitrogen. And then there was the couple that we just discussed for phosphorus. In terms of the human activities that affect it, not only do I want you to list these, but I want you to look for trends. And so tell me, there's some things that we're doing that are affecting all 3 of these cycles. So look for trends and reoccurrences. And that's the end of our phosphorus cycle podcast. We'll be checking in and discussing tomorrow.